Eldrazi, turn the mics off.
No, it's still an option. Okay.
Actually, it is still an option. Mugen is gone. Thank you. So that nonsense is over, even though it was kind of fun for a couple of months. But we got some new stuff in now for Modern, and this is what makes this tournament really exciting. We've covered a lot of invitationals, obviously. Ryan, I know this is your first one, but Matthias, me, and Patrick have covered a lot of invitationals. We've not had one like this before, where we've got basically a brand new standard format, 1 week of results to work off of, and then who knows what people are going to do in Modern.
Right.
I have no idea. The talk, and we'll start with kind of the obvious one, is Ancestral Vision and where the heck this card fits in. Patrick, this card is very powerful. We were kind of playing a lot during that time. I think some players who might be newer to Magic, this card's banned in Modern. Why is it banned? Is it really that good? I think the answer is yes.
This card puts a ton of pressure on your opponent to be able to end the game inside of 4 turns. If you suspend this, you interact for a couple of turns, this comes off, you're a huge favorite to win games in most matchups. This card slots into a lot of pre-existing decks. You can see Grixis Control, Jeskai Control, a deck like Scapeshift can very easily incorporate this card, so I think this slots in very nicely into some pre-existing decks. The problem, as always, is in Modern you get killed on turn 3 or on turn 4 pretty frequently. You're going to die with this card suspended a fair bit, even if it's in your opening hand, but the reward is certainly there.
I love it when my opponents suspend Ancestral Visions. It's like they mulliganed. It's great.
You feel that strongly about this? This card has to be great.
I don't want the game. I'm not playing a deck where the game's going to go that late. And Patrick touched on that. That's one of the issues in Modern. There's a lot of people who are trying to do unfair things. But the card is really powerful.
Now, Ryan, what do you think? Matthias is saying, I'm just going to kill you. Are you trying to play this sort of strategy? Suspend this on 1, interact a bunch, and then draw my cards?
I actually played a Modern tournament last weekend with Ancestral Vision in my sideboard. I'm kind of swear by Delver of Secrets, and I couldn't bring myself to have that frustration between choosing which one to actually commit to on turn 1.
Okay.
So I put it on the sideboard, forgot about it, boarded it in approximately half the time, haven't figured it out if I want to main deck this card or sideboard it. It is really tough to figure it out in Modern, because sometimes you do just die, other times you play against Jund, and they actually can realistically never beat a good 3 cards off of Ancestral Vision out of a Snapcaster Mage deck. So I'm really torn. If somebody figured out a good, solid 60-card main deck for Grixis Control, I think it's very well positioned this weekend.
Now, of course, with Ancestral Vision, you've got to warp how you build your deck. You got to be able to actually suspend this thing on turn 1 if it's in your opening hand. If you've got a lot of lands that enter the battlefield tapped, Creeping Tar Pit, Celestial Colonnade, it's going to be a bit of an issue. But I know there are a lot of big fans of blue cards behind us that are going to try to figure this out. The other big kind of elephant in the room is the unbanning of Sword of the Meek, and in combination with Thopter Foundry. And where does this slot in? Does this build a deck on its own? Does it go into Lantern Control? Nobody really knows. Ryan, did you have this in the sideboard of your Delver deck too?
Actually, no.
Okay.
It turns out that when you reveal Sword of the Meek to Delver, your opponent just kind of laughs at you.
That makes sense.
And you still have a 1/1. So
You could equip it in a turn down the road.
We tried it, didn't pan out, I guess is what I'm going for here. Jerry Thompson has been playing this deck. He topped 32 at the Classic in Baltimore. He had a lot of good things to say about the deck, and this is another thing where it's really difficult to hammer down even your starting 60, much less your 75. The most successful and powerful list that I've seen so far have been playing Gifts Ungiven. That seems to be the best direction for this deck. You can find both sides of your combo, Academy Ruins and, say, Teleria West for your second copy of Academy Ruins. If you're feeling like playing a very long game, you can play Crucible of Worlds. A lot of ins and outs for figuring this card out, but the combo in play, very powerful and ends the game very quickly against a lot of decks. Though the decks Matthias plays are going to ignore it.
Perfect. So what do you think about this? You not care about this either?
There are some combo decks that do care about it, so you do have to watch out. For example, this is actually fairly good against Infect.
Okay.
And an honorary combo deck, it's good against Affinity as well.
Okay.
That said, I'm going to go on the record, and I think that Thopter Sword right now is a bit of a trap. There are too many decks that I think are trying to win the game before Thopter Sword is online, and there are a lot of, the problem is that this interaction is only so-so against a Jund deck, and if it's not shining there, I'm not certain I'm into it. Now, Jerry Thompson's going to play this kind of list, and he can certainly prove me wrong about it, but right now, I haven't seen enough good finishes in any of the Modern events I've been playing to really be convinced that Thopter Sword is a thing.
What do you think?
Well, I looked at Jerry's list that he posted that he did well with in the Classic, saw Gifts Ungiven and Mull mixture and just said, all right, this is kind of outside of my deck building wheelhouse here. I think that if you're going to be successful with this deck, it kind of needs to be an incidental thing. And Jerry's list, I think, is a good starting point because it's a control deck that can kind of go about winning the game in a variety of different ways and go assemble the combo against people who are vulnerable against it. I think trying to just push on the combo, trying to make that the only thing that's going on is not going to be successful. A lot of decks don't care about it, and a lot of the decks can play over the top of it. But if it's a part of a greater package, I think there's something there.
Yeah, Blue-White Tron we've seen play this, and it actually does seem really good. You have a lot of mana to gain life quickly, and cards like Gifts Ungiven.
So that kind of gives you an idea of the cards that are being unbanned, welcomed into the format. Now, there are some things that have been here for a little while, and Mr. Ignore my opponent over there, I'm going to come your direction in just a moment with the Scapeshift talk, but we're going to actually go to Snapcaster Mage. That's your interaction. That's what you're looking for. So we're talking Snapcaster Mage with Lightning Bolt, with other 1-mana spells, Gitaxian Probe. Really hard to build a deck with this card. Path to Exile, Inquisition of Kozilek. Ryan, I know that you like Snapcaster Mage, so what are your thoughts here as we move along here pretty quickly?
So I know that the card's been legal in Modern for a very long time, but it actually feels like it did just come off the ban list, because you could not play this card during Eldrazi Winter. It was super bad. So now you have to be ready to play a game against Bolt, Snapcaster Bolt, Spell Snare, Snapcaster Spell Snare, and be ready to beat that kind of efficiency and card advantage. So if you're not ready for Snapcaster or playing Snapcaster, which is what I advocate, it's going to be a rough weekend for you.
Matthias, what do you think?
Well, so the one thing I think this is where the Ancestral Visions unbanning I think is actually really relevant.
Okay.
So the old Jeskai control decks actually used to have some issues with them in that they never really had a great Jund matchup. They got outclassed by the black-green X decks. Now that Ancestral Visions is around, that matchup's a lot closer, may even be on the Grixis or like Jeskai side of things. And so once you can play those decks and beat the other mid-range decks, Snapcaster strategies look a lot more appealing because they were already good against a lot of the field.
Snapcaster Mage is really good, as we know.
Still good.
Yes, shocking.
Still
I know.
good.
It did actually kind of come back, as Ryan mentioned, because of Eldrazi Winter kind of pushing it out. Now it's definitely back. I don't want people to forget that this is a thing people are doing, and it seems like a pretty safe direction to move towards.
Definitely, and the reason that I've brought up Ancestral Vision in the Jeskai shell, it's related to Snapcaster Mage as well. You have a lot more 1-mana removal in Lightning Bolt and Path to Exile than a lot of the other control decks do. So you have a very natural game plan of suspend Ancestral Vision, you have Bolt and Path to get out of the first few turns, Snapcaster on that spell to get out of the next turn, then your Ancestral comes off, you're up a bunch of cards, you should be very ahead in the game. So I think that Jeskai does that a little bit more reliably than Grixis does. You have discard spells, but that's not necessarily interacting with the board. And I think Ancestral slots in very nicely into the Jeskai shell, and Snapcaster Mage is a big part about giving you the time to get your Ancestral off suspend.
I mean, it's just, it's not a kind of deck style that we can forget about. Snapcaster Mage is that good. So I think we're going to see quite a bit of it this weekend, and it's also a pretty safe option. Now, we'll get to more safe options this weekend in just a moment, but we are going to get to one that actually ended up winning the Classic last week. We saw Scapeshift get the job done, which I'm sure made you very happy down there in the red hat.
Big fan of Scapeshift. Now, when we talk about unbannings and bannings, we've been talking about Ancestral Visions and Sword of the Meek, but I think one of the things that we forget is that if you go back 3 months, Splinter Twin was banned 3 months ago, and because Eldrazi came onto the scene at the same time, I don't think as a format we really felt the effects of the Splinter Twin banning until now. And one of the things is that whether you're talking about the blue-green Scapeshift deck or just red-green Titan Scapeshift, both those decks were very weak to Splinter Twin, and that was one of the kind of things keeping the deck at bay. But now the Splinter Twin's not there, I think Valakut strategies just in general have become a tier 1 thing. A lot like Tron, they're very good against the 3-color decks of the format. You know, your Juns, your Obzons, Grixis, Jeskai. Killing people with lands is a really safe way to do that. On top of that, you get to play a lot of removal and sweepers, so you're okay against some of the Zoo decks or Affinity decks of the format. It doesn't surprise me, Daryl Ayers is great at Scapeshift. He won the Classic last weekend, and to see this deck come up to the front, things like what I like about both Daryl Ayers' Scapeshift build and the red-green Scapeshift builds is that they are decks with 4 copies of Valakut in the main, either with a stack of Mountains or a Prismatic Omen that actually doesn't need a card like Scapeshift to win the game. They're just going to play this value game plan of play some lands, lightning bolt some things, win in a very hard-to-interact way.
Ryan, what do you think about decks that are kind of not interactive like this, and how do you think it lines up? Agreeing with Thias or disagree a little bit?
If I'm playing a non-interactive deck, I want to have that potential to kill on turn 3. Of course, that violates the rules of Modern.
Sure.
But you want to play the Affinity and the Infects for me to actually get my attention. The Valakut, you are playing the non-interactive game plan, and you're relatively strong against Mana Leak and Remand, the 2 most commonly played counterspells in Modern. So that's a good place to be. But the fact that the other non-interactive decks can so easily erase you is problematic. That's the reason why I shy away from decks like this.
Patrick, I think of Zoo when I think of red decks for you. I don't think of Scapeshift for you, but I think that the kind of decks that you play typically do okay against Scapeshift. Is that the kind of deck that you'd be worried about playing against this weekend?
Well, it's just a function of the speed of the format. And if Ancestral Vision does some work in slowing the format down, I think this deck gets a lot better as a result, because I think it's very good against slow decks that are playing with a lot of counter spells. As far as the combo decks go, it might be the best in terms of playing that sort of game. I never felt like this deck was particularly good against the fastest decks of the format. Often the first 3 turns of the game, they're doing very little outside of playing lands. But if the decks that are killing you on turn 3 or on turn 4 are on a bit of decline, if we see more 3-color decks that are incorporating Ancestral Vision, Scapeshift could be an excellent call.
And this is a deck that you can actually put Ancestral Vision into if you want to. Now, here's the thing about this format. We're talking about all these kind of unbannings and things that people can do, and like kind of the unbanning of Snapcaster, Mage, and Scapeshift. There are some decks that are still going to be here. They were here during Eldrazi Winter. They're probably going to be here this weekend. Of course, that's Affinity, which makes you think of Arcbound Ravager. That is Infect, hi Tom Ross, with Blighted Agent. And then there is Burn with Goblin Guide and Lava Spike and all that stuff. For me, these are the safest choices of the weekend, Patrick. You know what you're getting into with these. These were good before. They're good again, presumably. And if the format is slowing down, these are the fast decks that these slower decks have to try to beat.
And you have some built-in resistance against the cards that just came off the unbanning, because they're both cards that are slow to develop. And if you're just killing someone on the 3rd or 4th turn of the game, those cards aren't going to be very big players. So these are safe choices. They're going to show up in big numbers for sure. The specifics of the format where the metagame's at are going to determine whether or not these decks are good choices. But if things slow down and people are trying to incorporate Ancestral Vision to a bunch of decks, playing decks like Affinity, Burn, and Infect are a pretty good spot to be in.
Ryan, would you select one of these decks for the weekend, or are you trying to beat these decks this weekend?
I'm trying to beat these decks usually. The difficulty with these decks is that you only get 15 cards in your sideboard. So there's very good cards against all these decks, but your opponent's not going to have access to all of them for everything. And we've seen time and again with Affinity, sometimes it doesn't matter. You can beat an Ancient Grudge, you can beat a Kataki. So these decks are definitely very solid choices, and people that play Affinity are going to play it every weekend anyway, and sometimes they're going to win.
Matthias, for you, I know you like control decks. You got to try to beat these coming into the weekend.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to play combo before control, given the option. Burn, yes, for this weekend. Ancestral Visions and Jund are both pretty weak to burn. I like it. Affinity, I'm off for this weekend. I think there's a little too much Kolaghan's Command and Snapcaster Mage running around for me to want to play that. Infect, so-so.
Okay. I mean, these are going to be here. We know that. That's not going to be much of a surprise. Tom Ross is in the room. Yeah, we're probably going to watch him play Infect sometime. Maybe some of the Roanoke guys, because he works with those guys, will be playing Infect. We know some people are just going to play Burn, they're going to play Affinity. Will someone figure out Ancestral Visions? Will someone figure out Sword of the Meek and Thopter Foundry? That's the big question for the weekend. As we make our way through 8 rounds of Modern Magic, we're going to find that out. But that does it for our modern metagame breakdown, which means now